We all need to make smart decisions with our money. The Long-Term Investor Podcast shows you how by distilling complex financial matters into easily digestible lessons. And now, here's your host, Chief Investment Officer at PlanCorp and the author of Making Money Simple, Peter Lazaroff.
One of the trickiest things about personal finance is the sheer number of choices. It doesn't matter the details of your specific situation. We all face countless decisions, and each option comes with a lot of underlying complexity. Wading through choice after choice, it's just not easy to do, especially on your own, and consistently making the best choices becomes exponentially more difficult. And as a result, most people struggle to figure it out. And we face endless obstacles too. For starters, the human brain just isn't hardwired to rationally think about money decisions. We also have to live with the fact that advertisers subtly follow us around the internet and even our homes to strategically encourage us to consume. Then there's Wall Street, of course, spending billions of dollars to convince you to take actions when you probably shouldn't. And nobody receives a formal personal finance education led by a knowledgeable and unbiased expert. So many people struggle to understand where to start and what to do with their money. And that's why I wanted to write a book. In 2019, I published Making Money Simple, the complete guide to getting your financial house in order and keeping it that way forever. And when I outlined Making Money Simple, I wanted to give readers a clear starting point, focus only on the most important decisions to make, and share my saving system that quietly nudges your finances in the right direction without regular effort on your part. And the book's broken into 3 parts. The first section's all about goal setting and building a system for financial success. The second section focuses on investing, and the third section is about big financial decisions that happen infrequently, but are really important to get right the first time. Today's episode is the first in a 3-part series where I'll outline the important messages from these 3 sections. And to be clear, I'm not going to read you the entire book. I did actually record the audiobook, which I know is on Audible and is probably in other places where you can listen to books on tape. So if you prefer a book on tape to reading a hard or electronic copy, go ahead and check that out. But for now, I'm going to highlight some of my favorite passages and outline the important concepts of each section. Starting again with section 1, which is chapters 1 through 4 on goal setting and building a bulletproof saving system for growing your wealth. But first, I want to make some quick comments on the introduction, which was supposed to be chapter 1. I remember I didn't even really realize it until the typesetting stage of the publishing process. The introduction was supposed to be chapter 1. Chapter 1 was supposed to be chapter 2. Chapter 2 was supposed to be chapter 3, and so on. But there was some sort of misunderstanding between the publisher and me. I had chapter titles for each chapter, and chapter 1's title was, in fact, Introduction. But the publisher thought that I meant it to truly be an introduction that's not part of the book. And like I said before, it wasn't until the typesetting was done that we were way past the point of return, and I saw that the introduction had been placed outside the normal chapters and the table of contents. And you're probably thinking, so what? But this gave me an unbelievable amount of heartburn. The distinction might not even make sense, but if you flip through the book, you'll see what I mean. I had a number of early readers reach out to me who said they skipped the introduction. They didn't even know it was there. And they went straight to chapter 1, and I know I'd do the same. So the book sort of seems to start abruptly. So this is sort of my sounding board to say, like, it wasn't supposed to be that way. And anyways, the chapter, it sets the stage for why it's important to learn about money. And it also has one of my favorite quotes. Quote, "In school, you're given a lesson, then a test. In life, you're given a test, and then you learn a lesson. And money lessons can be expensive." If you've listened to earlier episodes, you've actually heard me say this already. I was fortunate that I took an interest in the topic of finance at a very young age, but I never took a course in high school or even college that really educated me the way that was needed to make good money decisions. That education was entirely left up to me. Another line that I really liked in the introduction was financial success isn't magic, it's engineering. I remember writing down this phrase after spending a day with executives and senior members of an investment firm, and nearly everyone that day was saying it in some form or another. And I was, and I still am, very familiar with that particular firm's messaging, yet I hadn't seen that phrase anywhere. And actually, I still haven't seen that phrase anywhere. So it must have been some sort of corporate retreat where it really got inserted into their language. But I remember the first time I heard it, I liked it. And the second time I heard it, I was like, oh, well, that's what so-and-so said. And the third time I heard it, I thought, okay, I better write this down. And it makes sense. Financial success is more about putting systems in place that best leverage the power of compounding and encouraging good financial behaviors. And typically, the most effective systems and processes are those that remove the opportunity for us to exert any sort of ongoing influence over our finances. In other words, make a whole bunch of really good decisions and then implement them. Don't give yourself a chance to bail. As I said earlier, the human brain, it just isn't hardwired to make optimal money decisions because our cognitive and emotional biases, they're creating all these barriers to our financial success. But in my opinion, you're never going to take the human nature out of humans. So by putting these processes and systems in place that acknowledge the inherent human biases that we're going to deal with, we can start to build around them. And that's the engineering part that makes financial success sometimes, quite frankly, seem a bit magical. The right thing to do often is so simple that it seems it can't possibly be right. And that's, I think, a lot of what makes that line resonate with me, that financial success isn't magic, it's engineering. So those are the big takeaways I have in the introduction that, again, is more about why this topic is important. So chapter 1, the title is The Power of Time and Compounding. And I remember thinking this chapter was going to go with the investing chapters. But ultimately, I bumped it to the front of the book because so much of what you are doing when you're setting up a system for your savings and your finances is that you're just trying to make sure that you leverage the power of compounding. And when you automate it, it becomes really, really useful. The first sentence of the chapter is one of my favorites because it's so true. Quote, "The most powerful tool you have for reaching your goals is time." So time mixed with the power of compounding is the most potent combination for wealth creation. And that's why I dedicated episode 1 entirely to that topic. Another quote that sticks out to me from that chapter is, quote, "Whether you're saving early and often, systematically adding to your investment portfolio, or staying the course in times of uncertainty, time has the power to turn small habits into incredible results." So James Clear wrote a book called Atomic Habits that unfortunately I didn't read prior to writing this. I wish I had, but it's basically that sentence on steroids. And to be clear, I'm not comparing my book to a worldwide bestseller that is Atomic Habits, but I'm saying that my research on habits greatly influenced the systems described in my book. I mention Atomic Habits because I really think that's the best book out there on how to build good habits. But it was actually a different book published several years prior called The Power of Habit that piqued my interest in habits to begin with, how they're formed, how they're triggered, how they're changed, etc. Good habits require training, almost like the complete rewiring of your brain. And those good financial habits, they're extremely counterintuitive to human nature. But unlike other habits like healthy eating, reading more, meditating, whatever, good financial habits can be automated. Good habits and automation, so now we're starting to engineer something for powerful results. Chapter 2 is titled, Where Do You Want to Go? It's one of the longer chapters in the book, but there was only a single quote that I felt really stuck out. And again, it was the first sentence. Turns out I really like the first sentence of each of my chapters, but here it is, quote, "Financial success doesn't just happen, it's incremental." I think this is a challenge for a lot of people because you don't see these immediate results. And similarly, it's hard to make progress without knowing where you're trying to go. So all too often, I find that people make money decisions without considering the impact on their future. In fact, research shows that our brains think of saving very similar as giving money away to a complete stranger. And so chapter 2 seeks to solve for that disconnect while also laying out a bit of the process for goal setting that makes this progress more apparent. And because financial choices aren't recognized for a long time, it's harder to get excited about the progress. So think about when you go to the gym for a week, you might notice some differences in your performance or in your appearance. But with finances, that's probably not the case. However, and here's the good thing, you can't get a six-pack by going to the gym just once, but you can potentially see the long-term benefits from just 30 minutes of financial exercise. Again, you have to play the long game, even if the results seem small at first, but the power of compounding in time, as we talked a lot about in chapter 1, makes a big, big difference here in seeing the performance just from a little bit of commitment to improvement. Another quote that I liked in the chapter is that, quote, "There's no such thing as a final draft of your financial plan." So when you're laying out the process for deciding where you want to go, I also outlined some ways to prioritize different goals. And the chapter outline something on where to save for retirement. And there's actually a blog post I have that I can put in the show notes if you want to see that order here. But ultimately, I always prioritize retirement savings and emergency fund first. Then I cover some investing versus paying down debt sort of rules within the chapter. But I also try to talk a little bit about prioritizing your consumption-based goals. And my general bias is when you're ranking consumption-based goals, you're really trying to prioritize those that are experiences or those purchases that will create time, give you some of your time back. I think the aim of trying to favor those experiences, those purchases that create time over material goods, the research shows that that will create longer lasting happiness. But even recognizing that you can create this perfect prioritization in one single moment, a year later, things change, different opportunities arise. And really, the financial plan is not some neatly bound binder that tells you everything you need to know now and forever. It's more of a living, breathing document that's going to have to change and adapt to your goals. Chapter 3 is titled, Where Are You Today? At this point in the book, you know where you want to go, but before you can start heading there, you need to understand where you are today. So I go through the importance of completing a net worth worksheet to represent where you are today. And you can get that at the show notes at thelongterminvestor.com. So once you've filled out a net worth worksheet, before you make any personal finance decisions from here out, you can ask yourself 2 questions to help choose your next course of action. The first is, how does this affect my net worth? And 2, how does this impact my ability to reach my goals? The first question measures financial success in the traditional mathematical sense. And in most cases, making good financial decisions should lead to an increase in your net worth. So when you're using the net worth worksheet, it can be a useful tool when you're evaluating a major purchase, such as an unplanned trip with friends or buying a new car. But do realize that spending money is not necessarily a bad thing. It's really just about making intentional choices with your saving and spending so that you get the most out of your money. For example, an unplanned trip with friends, that may not be in your budget, and it certainly will reduce your net worth. But if you place a high value on travel and spending time with friends, then the hit to your net worth is probably worth it. Plus, we know that experiences tend to generate longer lasting happiness. So there you go. But examining a car purchase, that can be a little trickier. Buying a car is going to ding your net worth, but it's probably a necessary expense. And it may even be a goal that you meticulously plan and save for. But how might spending more on a nicer car affect your other goals? So framing decisions in the context of your goals can help you make better decisions and minimize regret. And to better answer some of these questions, you also have to complete the cash flow worksheet, which I walk through, because that drives how much you can contribute to your goals. Now, one problem that I address in the book is when someone reaches the cash flow worksheet stage and they discover, oh no, there's less monthly cash flow available than what's required to save for my goals. Which brings me to one of my favorite quotes. Quote, "The idea of cutting expenses is often talked about like a tragic event, but that isn't a productive way to frame the act of saving money. Saving isn't about making sacrifices. It's about keeping your priorities and getting more of what you really want." I think that is a really important concept. And so just to highlight some of the details of if you're spending too much, the advice that I give, rather than focusing on the typical cut out your Starbucks advice, I feel like the first step is simply just to skip all impulse purchases. So if you really are trying to find ways to cut back, when you go to a store, make a list of what you need to purchase and don't purchase anything else. If you feel like once you're at the store, there's something else you need, ask if you need that item in the next week. If you need that item in the next week, fine. If not, skip the purchase. Now you've gotten rid of impulse purchases. Now that's really tough to do when you're online shopping, or if you're an avid user of Amazon and you hop on Amazon to get something that you intended. But maybe you make a list. If you're really, really trying to find ways to cut back the spending, remember that those who are selling you things have done a lot of research on human behavior, and they know that we're impulsive. And so we have to try to rein in those impulse purchases. Another trick that I talk about in the book to get your lifestyle expenses more in line with the things that you enjoy is to look at a recent summary of your spending, whether that comes from an account aggregator like Mint.com or Brightplan. You can sort your expenditures into 3 categories. So again, you print off a list of expenses and then you mark them either as best value, good value, or low value. Now, of course, this exercise assumes that you track expenses. So if you don't, that actually would be the first step. And ideally, if you share expenses with a significant other, you would do this exercise with them, because that really ends up making this very powerful. And then you can say, what are the items that we both place a high value on? So those are costs you definitely don't need to cut right now. But instead, you focus on the expenses that you both put in the low value category. These expenses are usually a lot easier to eliminate and free up a little extra cash to dedicate towards the things you really value in life. And of course, cutting expenses that offer no value, that's pretty painless, but finding the real big savings requires a little more work. And I go through some of those different things in the chapter, like buying term life insurance instead of permanent whole life insurance. Look, if other people depend on your income, then you likely need or already have life insurance. But not only is term insurance significantly less expensive than permanent insurance or whole life insurance, but most people are just better off with term insurance. Like 99% of the time, that's going to be your best bet. Another thing that you can do is increase the deductibles on your auto or home insurance. So the higher your deductible, the less you're charged on a monthly basis for your insurance coverage. And if you have an emergency fund that can cover the higher out-of-pocket expenses in the event of an auto accident or something that happens with your home, this form of self-insuring is pretty much a no-brainer. Of course, if you don't have an emergency fund, then this strategy won't make any sense. With a home, nobody's buying home insurance because it's fun. You need home insurance because if that asset burns down, the financial impact of not having insurance would be devastating. But again, taking on this strategy where you increase the deductible really only makes sense if you can afford to take on the additional liability in the case of an unforeseen event. Another idea thrown out there was to trade in your travel rewards credit card for one that earns 2% cash back. And people love miles and points. I love miles and points. I play the miles game myself. But if you're looking for extra cash, a cashback credit card might actually be more useful if you're spending too much to meet your goals. And in my experience, most people aren't savvy enough with their spending and redemption strategies to make the points more valuable than a simple cashback reward anyways. Refinancing your loans, I think that's an obvious big savers. Remember, refinancing, it's not free. It's important to make sure that the monthly cost savings will offset the loan origination costs and any additional interest expense that comes from resetting the term of your loan. But that is definitely a way where you could save hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on your debts. And one of my favorites is to buy cars less frequently. So here's a stat in the book. The average length of car ownership is 6.6 years. So that means that the average person will buy 9 or 10 cars from the time they graduate college until the time they reach age 85. So if you were to drive your car for 8 years instead, that would mean buying 2 fewer cars between the ages of 22 and 85. Think about that. The cost savings from buying 2 fewer cars compounding over multiple decades, that's going to result in a pretty significant bump to your net worth. Chapter 4. So chapter 4, the title's Creating a System for Financial Success. It takes everything from the first 3 chapters and puts them into action. And I kind of joke with people who I assume don't finish books front to back, that if you read just chapters 1 through 4 of my book, you will have really gotten most of the system that I've used to coach others to achieve financial success. I really like the opening to chapter 4, and I'm not going to read it verbatim, but I am going to kind of echo a little of the narrative here. So it really helps if you've ever read the Odyssey in high school. There's a story of Odysseus' journey home to Ithaca, which includes this part where Odysseus and friends, they sail past the island of the Sirens, and the Sirens sang a song that no sailor could resist. But if they steered the ship toward the island, they wrecked their vessels up on the rocks. So knowing this beforehand, Odysseus devised a plan to enjoy the Siren song while safely continuing towards his intended destination. Odysseus instructed his crew to fill their ears with wax and sail past the Sirens no matter what. Then Odysseus had the crew tie him up to a ship's mast so he could listen to the siren song without being tempted to steer toward the island himself. And the plan worked beautifully. Odysseus was able to hear the siren song without wrecking his ship, even though he begged to be freed the entire time. And it's because of the process he committed to in advance that safeguarded him from foolish decision-making. So in the present day, you face all sorts of temptations in everyday life that can distract you from your stated goals when you're making these financial decisions. Messages to consume, they never stop. And I had sort of mentioned this before, but advertisers, they literally follow you around the internet. And stores, they're meticulously placing and pricing merchandise to encourage impulse purchases. Meanwhile, social media makes you hyper aware of all the stuff your friends and family are buying, and it's just never, ever, ever been easier to spend money thanks to one-click ordering or mobile payments or in-app purchases. It's just all stacked against us as a consumer. As an investor, I think you face an even more complicated set of temptations. Wall Street spending all this money trying to convince you to take action when you shouldn't, and then the financial media, they're not helping anything. They're covering markets as if investing is a daily activity, and they create this sense of urgency that doesn't exist if you develop and follow a thoughtful plan to stay on course. So repeat after me. Wall Street and the financial media are not on your team. They are trying to encourage you to deviate from your intended course, which really just can lead to a financial mess. So resisting the modern day siren song, I think it requires a system, and a system that limits bad behaviors today but helps you make good financial choices for your future. What I'm talking about, economists refer to as pre-commitment, really just establishing processes that encourage good behaviors. And on top of a good system, they'll help you fight these temptations. You may decide that you need to leverage a human or a digital advisor to play the role of Odysseus's crew, which means they need to have their ears plugged with wax, figuratively anyway. But they also need to remain objective, unbiased, and themselves undeterred by the noise of markets and media. Otherwise, they won't be able to succeed in their role. If you go that route, your crew, they should help you stay tied to your financial plan to ensure you sail safely past all these temptations and onward to your goal. But whether you use an advisor or not, the systems I describe in Chapter 4, they help you stay on course during your financial journey and enjoy life the way that Odysseus enjoyed that siren song without actually tying yourself to a pole. And it starts with the reverse budget. I've discussed this on the show before. Rather than worry about tracking expenses, a reverse budget focuses on how much you need to save and the prioritization of your goals. And I have a blog post that I'll put up on the show notes exactly on how to set up one of these reverse budgets. And once that reverse budget is set up, then it's time to build the automated system that's going to power your long-term success. The benefits of automation align with the human tendency to embrace habits. In fact, more than 40% of actions people perform each day are driven by habit rather than actual decision. Habits are the consequence of our brain's constant search for ways to conserve energy. They free up our mental capacity from thinking about the basic behaviors such as walking or chewing our food so that we can devote mental energy to inventing spears or irrigation systems and eventually the steam engine and computers. Unfortunately, our brains don't differentiate between good habits and bad habits, and habits never really disappear. This makes it harder for me, for example, to avoid cookies in the office lunchroom or mindlessly eat in front of the TV. But not only are humans creatures of habit, we also don't like change. Change requires more mental effort, which our brains are hardwired to avoid. So routines become automatic, but change jolts us into consciousness, sometimes in really uncomfortable ways. So our preference as a species is to avoid change, and that can be leveraged by automating good habits. So I mentioned The Power of Habit earlier as a book that I really enjoyed. One quote from that specifically pertaining to this is, quote, "Willpower isn't just a skill, it's a muscle, like the muscles in your arms or legs, and it gets tired as it works harder, so there's less power left over for other things." So while it's important to visualize the future and keep our goals in mind when making financial decisions, that requires a lot of willpower. However, the habit of contributing to a savings account every week requires very little mental energy, particularly given how easy it is to automate those good practices. And by putting your personal finances on autopilot, you take advantage of the human tendency to embrace habit. Plus, as I mentioned before, it's easier than ever to do. One final quote from the book, and I guess maybe it's more of a passage, but one more quote here to close out Chapter 4. Quote, "Creating a system for financial success is all about making intentional, systematic choices with your money. A good system will direct dollars to the things that matter most and keep you on track for reaching your end goals. A systematic process can also reduce or eliminate our human tendencies that lead to poor consumption choices, as well as having subpar saving and investment decisions. But the system should also make it all automatic." For show notes, free resources, and a place to submit questions, please visit thelongterminvestor.com. If you enjoy the show, you can subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and please leave me a review. I will read every single one, and I appreciate you taking the time to let me know what you think. Until next time, to making money simple.
Thanks for listening to the Long-Term Investor Podcast. To access free financial resources and submit questions to be answered on the show, visit thelongterminvestor.com. Peter Lazaroff is an employee of PlanCorp and BrightPlan. All opinions expressed by Peter and any podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of PlanCorp or BrightPlan. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of PlanCorp and BrightPlan may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.